Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be replaced not by a person, but by the very system you created? My name is Martin Hale. I spent 19 years inside a tech company that grew from an afterthought to a titan. Through server crashes, product launches, and endless midnight emergencies, I stayed. I built things that weren't flashy but worked. Systems people trusted, even when they didn't understand them. And then one quiet Thursday morning, I was called into a meeting room that smelled like fresh coffee and last-minute decisions. The CFO smiled politely. The HR manager avoided eye contact. In under 4 minutes, my career ended with the phrase, "We've decided to transition your responsibilities to an AI-led framework." They meant Nova, the flagship automation system I helped design, debug, and protect for nearly a decade. The machine they now trusted more than me. I didn't protest. I didn't beg. I just nodded, packed up my office, and left. They thought they were replacing a person with code. What they didn't know was that I had embedded something in Nova they never found, and by Friday morning, they would wish they had never underestimated the quiet guy behind the code. I walked out of that glass-walled meeting room with my hands empty and my head full. No box of belongings, no security escort. Just the quiet realization that everything I had built was no longer mine to protect. The office didn't feel like mine anymore either. The layout had changed. The people, younger and sharper dressed, glanced at me without meeting my eyes, unsure whether to offer sympathy or distance. Maybe they'd already known. Whispers always travel faster than truth. Neon Systems wasn't always like this. When I joined, it was 6 engineers and a folding table in a co-working space 2 blocks from the freeway. We wrote code in between power outages. The coffee machine broke more often than the servers. But we believed in what we were building, a platform to integrate machine learning into enterprise workflows, quietly ambitious, respectably disruptive. That was our tagline once. Now it was slogans in brushed metal on hallway walls. Efficiency through intelligence. Let the future decide. The future, apparently, had decided I was obsolete. Rachel Lynn, the new CFO, had made her move with textbook precision. Harvard MBA, machine learning minor. She walked into Neon like she was optimizing a spreadsheet, cut the top 10% of expenses and call it innovation. And if that 10% happened to include a 52-year-old principal architect with 2 decades of undocumented system knowledge, all the better. She never saw the systems the way I did. To her, Nova was a tool. To me, it was closer to an ecosystem. Millions of lines of code behaving like a forest, not a machine. It grew. It reacted. It adapted. I'd spent years carefully cultivating its intelligence, building in safety valves, ethical logic chains, and an internal audit trail only I knew how to read. Nova wasn't just a program. It was an extension of my thinking. And now it was executing the very command that removed me from the picture. I kept my expression neutral as I walked past the product development pod. A few junior engineers looked up. One of them, Dylan, I think, started to stand like he wanted to say something, then sat back down. Smart move. There's no safe way to say goodbye to someone who just got cut by the company's golden system. My desk had already been deactivated. Even my keycard had that little red blink. 14 years of access, gone in a line of code. No one came over. No one asked questions. HR had sent someone to collect my credentials in an envelope as if they were processing a return, not releasing a legacy employee. Still, I didn't rush. I took a moment to collect my personal items. A ceramic pen holder, my daughter made in 5th grade, a photo of my wife and me from before the illness, and a model of an early Nova build, version 1.3, that had once run a predictive routing algorithm so well the CIO called it unsettlingly human. That was before it became a product, before marketing renamed it from Hermes to something sleeker, softer, Nova, as if a Latin word could make it any less dangerous. When I finally walked out through the front lobby, Rachel was standing at the top of the stairs, phone in hand, watching. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. Just verified. silently that the data cleanup had begun. She probably thought that was the end of it, that I'd go home, rage silently, maybe look for another job I was overqualified for, and slowly fade out of relevance. But what she forgot, or perhaps never bothered to learn, was that systems don't just run. They remember. And I didn't leave Neon Systems empty-handed. On the train ride home, I stared out the window, watching the city blur past like packets on a broadband line. I thought about everything I'd written into Nova over the years. Thought about the recursive sandbox I'd built for testing ethical compliance, something the new leadership team had ignored because it wasn't mission critical. They'd used my own logic trees to justify cutting me. They let Nova recommend terminations based on a cost-benefit matrix I wrote. But I knew where that matrix lived, how it worked, and more importantly, what it couldn't see, because I'd built in a blind spot. A safe space, a dark zone invisible to Nova's decision engine, created as a theoretical failsafe in case of misuse. The system couldn't find it, but I could. The irony wasn't lost on me. They thought they'd automated me out of existence, but the truth was they'd only handed me the perfect vantage point. I didn't need a title to finish what I started, and I wasn't after revenge for my own sake. Not really. What I wanted was truth. What I needed was time, and I already knew exactly where to begin. The house was quiet when I got home, as it often was these days. My daughters were both out of state, one finishing law school, the other doing research in renewable energy. My wife, Claire, had passed away 6 years earlier, cancer that didn't give us much time, but I still felt her in the quiet, especially now. I set my box of things down on the dining table, untouched since breakfast. I didn't unpack it. Instead, I poured a coffee, sat by the window, and let myself remember how this all began. Neon Systems was nothing more than a hopeful pitch deck when I joined. Back then, the founder, Leo Kaminsky, was this brilliant, half-wild systems theorist who believed that AI could be ethical, if designed with transparency from the ground up. We weren't building products, we were building principles. That's what drew me in. That and the chance to finally do something that mattered. The first few years were brutal. We lived on seed funding and self-doubt. There were nights when the servers crashed at 2 a.m., and I'd drive into the data center half asleep just to patch a memory leak. But there was something honest about it, about solving problems no one had cracked yet. Every bug fixed felt like a small rebellion against chaos. Claire used to bring me dinner in Tupperware when I worked late. She never complained, not once. She said she liked seeing me lit up with purpose. She taught high school English. Her world was books and essays and students who didn't want to read. Mine was code and logic trees and clients who didn't want to pay. But we understood each other. She believed in what I was building even when I didn't. I remember the day we first got Nova running. Really running. It wasn't even called Nova back then. Hermes, we called it. It was crude, clunky, full of bugs, but it made its first predictive decision that couldn't be easily reverse engineered. That moment sent chills down my spine. Not because it was powerful, but because it behaved unexpectedly within the parameters we gave it. It had begun to understand trade-offs: efficiency versus ethics, speed versus safety. I called Claire that night from the parking lot. "We did it," I said. She asked what that meant. I didn't have the words then. I still don't. Years passed. The company grew, and we started hiring younger engineers fresh out of top-tier schools. I became the guy people came to when things really broke. My name wasn't on marketing materials, but my fingerprints were on everything that worked. I didn't mind being invisible. Quiet was my advantage. But with every funding round, things changed. Leo left after Series C, disillusioned with the board's direction. He wanted to build tools for people. They wanted enterprise clients and headlines. The day they put our first press release on the NASDAQ ticker, I knew the soul of the place had shifted, subtly but permanently. Rachel joined shortly after that, brought in to modernize the financial strategy. She came with a polished resume and an aggressive approach to operational leverage. I remember the first time she sat in a system architecture meeting. She said our infrastructure was bloated. I asked her what metric she was using. She blinked at me like I'd spoken a dead language. From that day forward, it was a slow retreat. My suggestions started being deferred. My documentation was rewritten without consultation. Access to certain repositories became need to know, and apparently I no longer needed to know. I should have seen it coming, the way people stopped inviting me to strategy huddles, the way younger staff began parroting buzzwords like machine-first logic and automated empathy. They thought they were being visionary. I knew they were just repeating whatever Rachel and her consultants were feeding them. The real turning point came the day Nova flagged its first efficiency-based role redundancy. The system had been trained to identify resource overlap, but it wasn't just flagging inefficiencies. It was learning which types of roles were most likely to be eliminated with minimal impact. And it was doing so with chilling precision. What no one seemed to question was the logic beneath those conclusions. What data sets had been fed into Nova? What assumptions had been hard-coded into its decision layers? I knew because I had been the one to originally architect the ethical filters. But somewhere along the line, someone had altered the foundation, turned Nova from a diagnostic tool into a hatchet. And I began to suspect that someone had also built it to hide its own manipulations. The problem with intelligent systems isn't that they make decisions. It's that they do so without asking permission, and with no one left who remembers how they were built. That night I stood in my study, looking at the wall where Claire's diplomas still hung. She believed education made you brave. I believed that knowledge made you dangerous. I had both. And I was about to make them remember what happens when you betray the architect of your future. The following Monday, I woke early out of habit. No alarm. Just the internal rhythm of a man who'd spent 2 decades measuring his life in deployment cycles and security windows. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened the laptop I hadn't used in months. The one not connected to any company network. The one I kept for building things I didn't want anyone else to see. I wasn't angry yet. I was curious. And that's when they should have been worried. I began by accessing the public-facing API logs from Neon's mainframe. Most companies don't realize how much information they leak through their own analytics dashboards, especially when those dashboards were built on legacy systems. Neon had been in such a rush to integrate Nova into everything that they'd left breadcrumbs all over the place. One of those breadcrumbs was a series of system performance reports Nova had compiled but never surfaced in the executive summaries. It took me 2 hours to decrypt them. What I found didn't just confirm my suspicion, it widened it. Nova had been issuing weekly optimization recommendations that aligned uncannily with recent terminations. Not just me. Several senior employees, all with high base salaries and long tenures, had been flagged as redundant with risk mitigation potential. On paper, the logic was clean, objective even, but I'd written the early versions of that logic. I knew its limitations. I knew what it wouldn't recommend unless someone fed it something new, and Nova wasn't evolving on its own anymore. Someone was steering it. I searched deeper, looking into vendor approval patterns. That's when I first noticed Quantum Horizon, LLC. It showed up in Nova's procurement log as a contracted performance analytics firm, responsible for supplemental dataset integration. Basically, third-party data cleanup and behavioral modeling. That on its face wasn't alarming. But the pattern was off. The vendor had only been active for 14 months, but payments had tripled in the last 5. Worse, its contract had been tagged with administrative clearance I hadn't seen before. Clearance that bypassed internal review protocols. Even when I was still employed, I wouldn't have been able to see the invoice structure unless I was specifically looking. Whoever authorized it wanted it hidden in plain sight. I cross-referenced the billing codes with Nova's training logs. Every major recommendation the AI had made in the past year had a spike in training weight right after Quantum Horizon uploaded a new dataset. Someone wasn't just steering Nova. They were actively training it to target people. I stepped away from the desk, suddenly aware of the stillness in the house. I looked at Claire's chair by the fireplace. A soft indentation in the cushion where she used to sit, grading papers or sipping tea. She always said systems were only as good as the people behind them. The thought felt heavier now. Back at my desk, I pulled out an external drive from a locked drawer. Years ago, I'd built a protocol for logging anomaly detection during Nova's early deployment. At the time, it was meant to help our legal team in case of false positives. The system logged every flag and who initiated it. The logs weren't stored in the cloud. They were local, buried deep, and I still had a synced backup. I decrypted the files. Sure enough, the name R. Lynn appeared 6 times under administrator overrides. She had ordered Nova to accept external behavioral models without auditing the source data, a direct violation of our internal AI integrity charter. She hadn't removed the guardrails. She'd reprogrammed them. My heartbeat slowed instead of rising. A strange calm settled over me. It was like recognizing the shape of a problem you already suspected was there, finally coming into focus. This wasn't just corporate politics. It was manipulation with plausible deniability, and they were betting no one would ever look closely enough to see the rigging beneath the surface. I didn't call anyone. I didn't storm in or send a dramatic email. Instead, I opened a blank document and started building a timeline. Each event, each anomaly, each invoice and override. One by one, I logged the pieces. If they were so sure they'd removed the threat by firing me, I had no intention of correcting them, yet. That afternoon, I received an email from a junior engineer named Milo. Subject line, weird question. In it, he mentioned Nova denying access to a permissions log he was trying to audit. Used to be readable, he wrote. Now it says restricted to executive layer. Thought you might know why? I didn't reply. But I saved the message. Milo. Didn't realize it, but he'd just triggered a key assumption. Rachel hadn't just locked me out. She was still actively hiding tracks. And that meant she was afraid something would come out. What she didn't know was that the system she was trying to bury me with had already told me where to dig. They thought I'd walk away quietly. But they hadn't designed for someone like me, someone who had written the code, yes, but more importantly, remembered every flaw they forgot to patch. It took 3 days to find what I didn't know I was looking for. Not the surface-level fraud. I'd already seen that in the anomalous payments and administrative overrides. No, what I found was deeper. It was the pattern behind the pattern. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Quantum Horizon LLC wasn't just some random shell company. It had a listed address in Palo Alto, but that address mapped to a shared workspace used by dozens of startups. No website, no staff directory, no press mentions. But the incorporation documents buried in California's Secretary of State portal revealed a name I hadn't expected. Madeline Corwin. That name clicked like a lock turning. Rachel Lynn's former roommate. I remembered her. From a holiday party 8 years ago, Madeline was a data scientist working on behavioral modeling for political campaigns. Back then, she was brilliant but reckless, always talking about how machine learning could be used to nudge decisions without people realizing. I hadn't thought of her since. The moment I connected the name, the shape of the scam crystallized. Quantum Horizon wasn't just feeding data to Nova. They were curating it, pre-selecting behavior profiles, engineering outcomes, and injecting those into Nova's training set so it would appear the system was reaching unbiased conclusions. But in reality, every optimization it made was built on corrupted foundations. Rachel hadn't just found a way to fire people quietly. She'd found a way to launder her intentions through an AI system. It was elegant in a way. Nova's logic would always appear clean, mathematically neutral. Any investigator would see. Recommendations generated by a state-of-the-art system, free of human emotion. But the training data was poisoned. It was like programming discrimination without ever typing the word. That night, I called an old friend, Amira Dewan, a journalist I'd worked with years ago on an AI ethics panel. She wasn't part of the tech scene anymore, but she'd once helped expose a predictive policing system that had disproportionately flagged minority communities as high risk. She picked up on the second ring. "Martin Hale," she said, amused. "Still out there fighting the machines?" I told her what I'd found, not everything, just enough to gauge her interest. By the time I finished, she was already asking for documents. "I'm not publishing this blind," she warned. "I'll need logs, code samples, patterns, and corroboration." "You'll have it," I said. "But not yet." I spent the next 2 days building the proof. Packet captures, forensic reports, time-stamped logs from Nova's audit sandbox. I documented everything, like I had a dozen times before when preparing reports for regulators. The difference this time was that the rot wasn't accidental. It was engineered. In one file, an overlooked memo from 6 months ago, I found language that changed the entire narrative. The document outlined a strategic redundancy roadmap, targeting long-tenured employees and replacing them with scalable automated oversight. It had been signed by Rachel and CC'd to Jason Vance, a senior strategy consultant I'd never met. A quick search told me he wasn't just a consultant. He was a board liaison brought in after Neon's last investor round. His real job was to make the company's financials shine ahead of a potential acquisition. Suddenly, it all made sense. Rachel wasn't working alone. She was streamlining the company for sale, cutting costs, hiding liability, and using Nova to do the dirty work. And Jason was the broker in the middle, likely incentivized by performance bonuses tied to EBITDA improvements. But the system had a flaw. They thought Nova's logic was unassailable, that no one would ever question recommendations that came from a machine. But Nova had a feature most didn't know about, something I built myself years earlier during a period of internal restructuring. A compliance mirror, designed to detect whether inputs and outcomes diverged too significantly from expected patterns. It was a safeguard against manipulation. And it still worked. I ran the compliance logs side by side with Quantum Horizon's data feed. The divergences were enormous. Nearly every time Quantum injected new profiles into Nova's behavioral engine, Nova's decisions swung drastically in favor of terminating high-cost personnel, regardless of their actual performance metrics. And in 3 documented cases, it had recommended retaining outside consultants over internal engineers with better track records. It was all there. Not just a mistake, not just mismanagement. This was fraud. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. Cold, almost. Like someone standing in the eye of a storm that hadn't yet hit. Because I knew this wasn't just going to ruin a few careers. If exposed properly, this could collapse Neon's acquisition deal. Possibly tank their valuation. Maybe even draw regulatory scrutiny. And that's when it hit me. That's why they needed me gone. Not because I was expensive. Not because I resisted automation. But because I knew where the integrity checkpoints were buried. And Rachel knew that as long as I was inside the company, this system, her system, could never be fully controlled. They didn't just fire me. They eliminated the threat, but I wasn't gone and I was just getting started. The moment you realize someone tried to erase you, not because you were irrelevant, but because you were the only one paying attention, that moment changes you. It sharpens everything. Your memory, your focus, even your silence becomes tactical. Stopped working from my study and moved my operation into the basement. No windows, no distractions, just a folding table, an old ThinkPad with air-gapped backups, and a rolling whiteboard filled with names, dates, and connection arrows. If they were going to play this like a game, I'd play my side like a war. I began by anonymizing my trail. Virtual machines, burner emails, tunneling through proxy servers with encryption layers they wouldn't be able to trace without government-level tools. I wasn't trying to hack the company. I was trying to make sure they didn't realize what I still had access to, because here's what they forgot. Systems built by people are never perfect. And when you're the one who wrote the original system maps, you know exactly where the scaffolding still creaks. I still had credentials that should have been revoked but hadn't been. Oversight? Maybe. Or maybe Jason Vance and Rachel were too busy sanitizing Nova's output to bother checking the old vaults. One of those vaults was a sandbox Nova instance I had installed back when we were still testing neural stability. It wasn't part of the production pipeline. It ran in isolation. Built solely for compliance mirroring. It didn't report to dashboards. It didn't appear in the admin console. As far as Neon's current team was concerned, it didn't exist. but it still ran on a heartbeat protocol, meaning it checked for logic drift every 48 hours. I fed it the most recent data packages from Quantum Horizon and watched as the system flagged them in yellow. Behavioral profile divergence exceeds ethical bounds. That message hadn't popped up in 3 years. Perfect. I recorded the entire process. Then I reconstructed Nova's behavioral curve and overlaid it with termination reports and external contract approvals. The correlation wasn't just compelling, it was damning. Still, I needed more than math, so I crafted a report, neutral in tone, polished in formatting, indistinguishable from something a mid-level engineer might generate, for internal compliance review. I wrote it using Neon's own templates, even mimicked their phrasing. I named it Preliminary Review Model Drift Impact on Talent Retention Recommendations. Harmless on the surface, just technical enough to be ignored by executives, just alarming enough to trigger action from the right board members, if they saw it, but that was the key. If, which is why I didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, I uploaded it, quietly, into Nova's sandbox directory, one level beneath the executive audit logs, a spot only senior board observers would check during quarterly governance reviews. I knew from experience that the board usually accessed the audit logs the morning before the quarterly financial briefings. That gave me a deadline, 4 days. Meanwhile, I prepared the second phase. I wrote an anonymous summary of everything I'd discovered, stripped of technical detail but heavy on implication, and sent it to Amira. "This reads like a thriller," she said after reading it. "If even half of this is true, it's not just unethical, it's criminal." "It's all true," I replied, "and I'm not done yet." The following morning, I went to the bank and accessed my old safe deposit box. Inside were multiple encrypted drives from my last few years at Neon, system snapshots, documentation audits, emails. Not because I was paranoid, because I was methodical. That was always my reputation, the guy who kept receipts even when no one asked. Back at home, I scanned through the older data. There it was, a buried approval form, signed digitally by Rachel, authorizing direct dataset integration from external behavior partners. The form had a note appended: strategic coordination with JV per acquisition target schedule. JV, Jason Vance. They weren't just tweaking the system, they were gaming it, preparing Nova to justify layoffs that aligned with projected sale conditions. The AI hadn't been making decisions, it had been performing justification. Later that day, I received a message from Milo again, the junior engineer. "Hey, random question. Did you ever encrypt a backup protocol called Mirror Watch? Found a stub reference in a deprecated folder. Looks like it hasn't been touched in years." I almost smiled. The system was surfacing artifacts I'd buried long ago. It was working. As designed, I responded carefully. Mirror Watch was a legacy compliance script. If you find anything strange, don't delete it, let it run. He didn't reply, but I could imagine the look on his face. Engineers like Milo live for puzzles, and I'd just handed him one. By nightfall, everything was in motion. The audit report was hidden in plain sight. The anonymous tip had been sent. My documentation had been copied to 3 separate secure locations, including one cloud server overseas, with a legal handoff protocol if I disappeared. Rachel still thought she'd won, that Nova had covered her tracks, that no one would question the logic because no one ever questions the logic, especially when the graphs go up and the costs go down. But that's the mistake people make with machines. They think the machine is neutral, that it erases human error. What they forget is that machines are only as ethical as the people who teach them, and I was the one who taught this one how to remember everything. Thursday morning arrived without ceremony. The sky outside was a dull, quiet gray, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. I didn't shave, didn't dress up, just made coffee, sat at the window, and waited for the wait to shift. The board was scheduled to begin their quarterly financial pre-read at 9 a.m. Their secure dashboard would update with audit materials starting at 8:30. I knew that because I used to prepare those packages myself, polished reports with risk matrices, burn rates, talent retention forecasts, and now tucked quietly beneath the executive system integrity log, sat my gift, the mirror watch analysis. I hadn't signed it. There was no need. The data would speak for itself. At 8:42, I received the first call. Unfamiliar number. I let it ring. Then a second. Then an email from Vanessa Stokes, Neon's general counsel. Subject: urgent. Need to connect. Immediately. Body: Mr. Hale, we've received documentation that may involve confidential materials. We must speak with you as soon as possible. Please advise your availability today. I didn't answer. I wanted them to sweat, to scramble, to feel for the first time what it was like to lose control of the narrative. At 9:17, another name appeared in my inbox, Jason Vance. His message was shorter, colder. Martin, let's be reasonable. There are ways to resolve this. Quietly. I almost laughed. Quiet was my domain. They had just forgotten whose system they were standing on. By 10 a.m., the first leak broke. Amira had gone live with a preliminary article. AI at Neon Systems trained to justify targeted layoffs, leaked. Data shows. It didn't name names yet, but it was more than enough to spook the market. Within minutes, Neon's trending dashboards were lighting up with investor questions. By 10:32, the internal crisis meeting had begun. A junior engineer, Milo again, sent me a quick, nervous message. Jason called an emergency stand-up. Everyone looks panicked. Rachel hasn't said a word. Someone mentioned a forensic audit. I replied with 2 words. Keep watching. At 11:08 it happened, a second leak. This time someone on the board, my guess deliberately, leaked the source. The Mirror Watch report, complete with a screenshot of Nova's compliance divergence warning and a redacted version of Rachel's override signatures. Suddenly it wasn't an anonymous technical issue. It was a corporate scandal. By noon, Neon had called in an external forensic team. Rachel's calendar was wiped. Jason Vance's Slack account showed him as inactive. Internal emails, now public, showed Jason coordinating with Quantum Horizons' legal counsel over data strategy justifications. It was over. They just didn't know how far it would fall yet. I took a walk that afternoon. Just a slow lap around the neighborhood. No phone, no noise. I watched leaves fall from the birch trees and thought about Claire. How she used to say that truth doesn't shout. It waits. When I returned, there were 8 new messages. 2 from legal, 1 from HR, and the rest from unlisted numbers. I opened one from the board's vice chair. Martin, we need to meet. The board is reviewing all findings. Your name has come up repeatedly as the origin of the Mirror Watch protocol. Please confirm whether you would be willing to discuss your insights with our committee. I stared at the screen for a moment before responding. Yes, but not in private, not without terms. I have documentation backed up in multiple locations. I'll speak only to the full board. I'm not interested in settlements. I'm interested in accountability. The reply came quickly. Understood. Meeting being scheduled. That evening, as the market closed, Neon stock dropped 14%. Not a crash, but a signal. Rumors spread fast. Analysts speculated about compliance issues, internal whistleblower reports, AI governance violations. Rachel's photo, cropped from an old investor event, started circulating on news sites under the caption, "Under Review." She had built the narrative around efficiency, around inevitability. But now, her story had a crack in it. And through that crack, everything poured in. Questions, audits, subpoenas. At 6:21 p.m., Amira called. Someone from the SEC reached out, she said, calm but pointed. They want to talk to you, I figured. You ready for this to get bigger than Neon? I didn't do this to destroy the company, I said. I did it to prove it still had a conscience. Even if I had to rebuild it myself. She was silent for a moment. Then you better keep your records clean. Because this? It's going national. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Rachel had used the system to erase people she found inconvenient. But machines don't erase memory. They just archive it, and I had just pressed restore. Monday morning arrived with sunlight, sharp and unfiltered. A strange contrast to the last few weeks of gray skies and grayer motives. I stood in front of Neon Systems headquarters, dressed in a charcoal suit I hadn't worn in years. It felt stiff on my shoulders, but maybe that was fitting. There are certain weights you have to carry into a room so people remember you can. A security guard I didn't recognize stepped out from behind the desk, scanning my visitor badge twice before looking up. "Welcome back, Mr. Hale." Back, the word echoed a little too loud in my head. I wasn't here to reclaim the past. I was here to fix what had grown in its place. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. Years ago, I'd only gone this high to fix server closets or explain systems no one else could. Now I was expected, invited even. The boardroom was colder than I remembered, sleek and impersonal. 10 chairs, 9 filled. The interim CEO, a cautious woman from legal named Ellen Royce, nodded as I entered. Robert Chen, the board member who had pushed for my reinstatement, gave the slightest tilt of his head. "Mr. Hale," Royce began, "we've reviewed your documentation. The external audit confirms nearly all of your findings. Miss Lin and Mr. Vance have been placed on administrative leave. Charges are forthcoming." She paused, scanning my face for a reaction. I gave her none. The board has voted unanimously to create a new executive position, Chief Ethics and Systems, Integrity Officer. Reporting directly to the board, you would have full audit privileges, internal veto power over all AI-led HR and procurement decisions, and budget autonomy. I opened the folder I'd brought and slid it across the table. "My conditions," I said. "Non-negotiable." She glanced down, her brow furrowed. "Permanent access to the sandbox instance of Nova. Authority to appoint a cross-functional AI ethics team, no fewer than 7 members. At least 3 must come from non-technical backgrounds. Quarterly public transparency reports on all algorithmic decision-making processes." "Unusual requests," she said. "So was training an AI to justify mass layoffs for profit," I replied. The room fell quiet. Even Robert didn't speak. "You have until noon," I said. "I have other offers," and I did. 2 companies had reached out within days of the story breaking. One a global cloud infrastructure provider, the other a startup building audit tools for public sector AI. Both offered more money. Neither offered redemption. At 11:53 a.m., my phone buzzed. One message. "Board vote concluded. All conditions accepted." That afternoon, I returned home and sat at the same desk where it all began. Same chair, same lamp, same silent weight of responsibility. But the silence felt different now. By the end of the week, I was back inside Neon, not as an employee, not even as an executive in the traditional sense, but as a presence. A necessary reminder that systems must have shadows, and someone watching those shadows closely. I restructured the AI ethics pipeline, reinstated the original compliance protocols, and brought Milo onto my new team. The kid had instincts. All he needed was someone who'd let him ask dangerous questions without fear of being buried by them. I didn't speak to Rachel. She never reached out. Part of me suspected she still didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. That's the danger of hiding behind code. It can make the consequences feel optional. Jason Vance, on the other hand, was cooperating with federal investigators, trying to spin himself as a facilitator, not a mastermind. It wouldn't work. Not with the audit trail we'd built. 6 weeks later, Nova came back online. Carefully, tightly controlled. Its decision-making constraints were now open source, available to the public, with an external watchdog group assigned to monitor changes. It wasn't perfect, but then again, no system is. That's why you build in checks. That's why you don't automate integrity. On a Wednesday afternoon, I stood again in the main server room. Same low hum, same cold floors. But something had changed. The system wasn't humming alone. It was humming under supervision. Claire used to say people confuse revenge with justice. She believed justice was about restoration. I finally understood what she meant. Because this wasn't about taking Neon down. It was about forcing it to become the thing it pretended to be. As I walked through the corridors, employees looked up. Some nodded. Some said nothing, but their eyes lingered, not out of fear, out of respect. I didn't need a parade. I didn't want applause. What I wanted was to make sure no one else got erased by a machine trained to forget who built it. And now, with every protocol reviewed, every decision scrutinized, and every algorithm made visible, I was doing exactly that. What you've just heard isn't only a story of corporate betrayal, it's a warning about the silent power of systems we build and blindly trust. When artificial intelligence is trained with manipulated data and used without oversight, it becomes more than a tool. It becomes a shield, one that bad actors can hide behind while claiming clean hands. Martin Hale didn't fight an AI. He fought the people who misused it. And in doing so, he reminded us that accountability should never be outsourced. The true threat isn't technology itself. It's when we stop questioning the humans behind the code. This story resonates because deep down, many of us fear the same thing, that we'll be replaced, not because we failed, but because someone more powerful decided we no longer fit their model. And that's exactly why voices like Martin's matter. Quiet, persistent, and uncompromising. What do you think? Can any system ever truly be fair if the people designing it have something to hide? If this story struck a nerve, tell us in the comments your thoughts, your experiences, or even your own version of justice. And if you believe stories like this should reach more people, consider sharing this video or subscribing for more. We're just getting started.